Ce matin, on a le privilège d'avoir une deuxième conférence par le Dr Lightfoot qui va remplacer Dan Evans-Lanswood qui était supposé venir mais qui n'a pas pu se présenter. Alors, le Dr Lightfoot a gracieusement accepté de donner une deuxième conférence, cette fois-ci sur le gisement de Voisey Bay.
Hello again, and thank you for putting up with me twice. I think Dawn would have loved to have been here, but unfortunately she wasn't able to come. I hope I can do her presentation justice. We have been aggressively exploring at Voisey Bay for over 15 years now, since the initial discovery of mineralization on Discovery Hill. This picture shows. We've had a team of people working there almost continuously, trying to change the reserve situation, and also to hopefully, well, I hope I intend to show you how they've worked very hard to fundamentally change our understanding of the Voisey Bay system. I'm going to just summarize the points I'd like you to leave this presentation with. The first is that, as I showed you in the earlier presentation, dike-like bodies are very important. At Voisey Bay, there is a dike-like conduit which connects two intrusive bodies. It's effectively the same age as those bodies. One is a chamber exposed at surface, we refer to as the Eastern Deeps intrusion, and the other one at depth we refer to as the Western Deeps intrusion. And those intrusions sit within a west to east structural corridor which passes right through the suture between the Churchill Province gneisses to the west and the older Nain gneisses to the east. The Voisey Bay deposit is structurally controlled right at the nexus of those different major features. So the conduit geometry is controlled by those structures and by their intersection. The sulfide deposits themselves reside within what I can refer to as structural traps or dilations within the geometry of the conduit, and at places where the conduit opens up into the magma chamber. These are key locations which control the distribution of mineralization. I'm going to show you a diversity in sulfide ore compositions, and that carries on from my earlier presentation where, as I said, then I believe these sulfides are introduced with the magma into their final resting place. They're not actually generated in situ, and the diversity in composition points to the injection of multiple different phases of sulfide magma into the Voisey Bay system. Our exploration models focus on these dilatant zones. They focus on multiple entry points into intrusions, and over the last few years that's where our effort has been placed. It's been placed in following up the Reed Brook zone to depth as it enters into the western subchamber, and also in the southern part of the Red Dog and Ryan's Pond area of the Eastern Deeps chamber. So let's start with the geological map of the main block as it's referred to. This is the original holding of land that comprises the main block around the deposit. Here's Voisey Bay in the south and Anactolac Bay in the north. The actual Voisey Bay intrusion, which is 1.35, 1.34 billion years old, is shown in the blue color. The main intrusion here comprises the Eastern Deeps intrusion, which is this body here. And there are also parts of this body that are broken up as blocks within a younger granite to the south. This is referred to as the Red Dog area. This area here where some troctolite blocks also develop is referred to as Ryan's Pond. And roughly the troctolites extend as dismembered blocks as far east as about this location here. As you go west, the intrusion turns into a dike, which extends over its surface through Discovery Hill into an area here we referred to as Reed Brook. This is Reed Brook coming down into Voisey Bay. Other areas of outcrop of the Voisey Bay type troctolite are in the Ashley area here and in Cogtaluk Brook in this area here. And there are also some isolated outcrops of troctolite and olivine gabbro to the north. Virtually all of these pieces of troctolite and olivine gabbro are dismembered blocks, rafts, or bodies sitting within younger granite sheets. They're not actually sensu stricto intrusions, they're broken up pieces of intrusion. And somehow they had to arrive here. This whole area is a significant gravity anomaly, and we believe at some point underneath this area there is probably a troctolite at depth. There are a couple of known domains of mineralization. A small block of ground here, which was held by NDT, contained a small amount of mineralization, and there is another small showing referred to as the Ashley showing in this area here. So the Voisey's Bay intrusion is separated from another intrusion, which is about 20 million years younger, which is referred to as the Mushwar intrusion. And this has a much more regular, broadly synformal shape, outcropping essentially to the north of Voisey's Bay and extending down into areas here which were originally mapped as being part of the Voisey's Bay complex, but actually are probably more likely part of the younger Mushwar intrusion. Because all of these rocks are olivine gabbros, troctolites, and leucotroctolites, it's often hard to tell them apart. And the only way we know those are part of the Voisey's Bay intrusion is from looking at the detailed trace element geochemistry of the rocks. The named plutonic sweet mafic intrusions comprising Voisey's Bay and Mushwar are intruded into a series of older rocks which consist of the Archean gneisses, which are largely to the east, and those are interlayered in places with younger Churchill province gneisses. So there's a very, very complex thrust stacking of sheets of Archean and Proterozoic rocks throughout this whole area here. To the west of this is an orthoproxene-bearing dioritic gneiss referred to as the Enderbite gneiss. This again is Proterozoic in age. It's around about 1.87, and it crops out in this area here. A large part of the Eastern Deeps chamber and the ovoid actually sits within the Enderbite orthogneisses. The true contact that people refer to as the suture is probably over at this side of the whole deposit, but historically has been drawn down through the contact between this Proterozoic Enderbite and the Churchill Province gneisses, which is a major shear zone. And the conduit system that comprises the Voisey's Bay complex extends all the way from the Churchill Paragneisses in the west, right the way through the Enderbitic orthogneisses into areas which are actually underlain by these Nain gneisses underneath the granitoids in this area here. There are two young anorthosite complexes, one cropping out to the west. These are probably sheet-like anorthosites because the magnetic properties are almost transparent. You can see through these things to the gneisses underneath. This one to the east, Kanga Kluak, and the one to the west is the Ikadivlivik anorthosite body. The granites are some of the youngest rocks and comprise two principal groups: the Voisey's Bay granite to the east, which comprises a range of rocks from true granites right the way through to varieties of cyanites, and these are very much sheet-like intrusions. They're not plutons, plugs of granite. They're sheets of granite, and they cross-cut through the complex such that much of the intact complex rests underneath these granites, and you can actually see its subsurface extent shown in the dashed line here beneath this. And we now know it extends a little bit further to the east beyond this little pond here, which we refer to as Ryan's Pond. To the west, this complex extends as a large subchamber, which also corresponds to a gravity high in the area of Reed Brook. This area here is covered by about 150 meters of overburden, so it's a bit more difficult to tie together the geological picture here because the dike is also extensively broken up by these younger granites of the Makivinic Lake suite in this area here. These are the granites that completely destroyed the troctolites and olivine gabbros from Ashlia. These are the granites that completely destroyed the troctolites and olivine gabbros from Ashley, and they've done pretty well the same sort of job to the western end of the Reed Brook zone in this area here. The area to the north of the Eastern Deeps chamber here is underlain by a subhorizontal dike. This is the so-called north of Eastern Deeps feeder dike, and it extends all the way to the east and potentially carries on beyond that. We don't actually understand the geometry much past this line here to the east. So it's quite a complex geological pattern, with the key mineralization being tied into these light blue colored rocks, the purple rocks here of the Mushwa. There are some localized mineral showings like the Sarah showing here, and there's mineralization around the base of it, but nothing that has hung together in terms of a economically viable resource. So if we look at the geological section through this, we can basically see the Eastern Deeps deposit sitting at the base of the Eastern Deeps chamber, and this corresponds to the entry line of dike from the north. So this major deposit here, the net deposit actually sits in that dike to the north of the Eastern Deeps deposit. As you come towards the surface here, the southeast extension is developed in a shallow part of the Eastern Deeps chamber, and then the ovoid itself appears to be an opening or bud in the dike, which is full of massive sulfide at surface in this area here. The tail of the ovoid to the west turns into the mini ovoid as it develops back into the true dike configuration, which extends for roughly 2 kilometers to the west and contains a number of other mineral zones, including the Discovery Hill Zone, which is a system which appears to plunge down, and the amount of drilling here is very minimal underneath the ovoid at this point in time, so we don't actually know where this one goes. The Reed Brook Zone to the west, a fairly continuous zone which has been quite heavily drilled now in order to define a resource for the early underground mine operation in the area. This zone here now we know extends to depth almost as far as underneath the ovoid, to the depth of about 1.6 kilometers. It's somewhat discontinuous, but there are particular patches of mineralization that contain quite significant amounts of sulfide. So if we look at some of the different zones and just get an idea of the rocks from the system, I described to the ovoid deposit earlier on today, which is in the center of the system. The ovoid is presently the site of the open pit operation that feeds material essentially at the moment to the Sudbury infrastructure until the hydrometallurgy plant in Long Harbour is finished. The system here comprises almost essentially massive sulfides. If it's colored red there, it basically means there are no fragments in that sulfide whatsoever. It's a bit of a shock actually to see so much clean sulfide. The only minerals are the 3 sulfide minerals, which effectively in most cases are granules of pentlandite sitting in small amounts of chalcopyrite within these loops, and then large crystals of pyrrhotite. The main oxide minerals are these embayed grains of magnetite. The basal part of the ovoid, the segment that wraps around the outside, comprises these textures that we refer to locally as loop textures. Similar textures are observed in ores from Norilsk and other locations. They characterize essentially massive sulfides that have crystallized to produce effectively what are, in the sulfide world, the equivalent of pegmatoids, with massive crystals of pyrrhotite. Some of these single pyrrhotites can reach 1 meter in grain size, sitting with these loops of chalcopyrite and pentlandite at the edge. The pentlandite is both granular, and occasionally there's a little bit of X solution within the pyrrhotite. There's a little bit of nickel also in the internal structure of the pyrrhotite, but the ovoid is essentially characterized by very, very beautiful granular pentlandite, which is very easily liberated and makes almost the perfect sulfide ore. As you go from the outer margin of the ovoid towards the center, there is a discernible change in the overall textures. At the location near the very center of the ovoid, the ores are almost pure cubonite, There's probably 300,000 or 400,000 tons of this material, or at least there was, almost entirely cubonite with a little bit of magnetite. Where this material grades into the surrounding more typical mineralization, you see much coarser grained interlocking textures of pentlandite eyes sitting within pyrrhotite. You see loops of chalcopyrite, very highly resorbed magnetite. Sometimes these rocks can get 20 or 30% magnetite, and occasionally some more trace elements. In this particular case here, there was a little bit of galena tied into this mineralization, but typically lead levels in the overall ovoid are exceptionally low. So this is somewhat atypical, although it is characteristic of the broad texture that you see. The outside of the ovoid is characterized by a series of rocks that comprise breccia sequence rocks, and then there is a narrow zone of olivine, ferrogabbro, and ferrodiorite wrapped around the margin, which could almost be viewed as a chilled margin to the body. As you go back from the tail of the ovoid into the dike, there is almost no mineralization in this dike. It's effectively an olivine gabbro and a troctolite, and it's very hard to imagine how that sulfide actually got into place by injection through this part of the dike, which leads to the suggestion that some of the sulfide injection may have actually occurred rather than in a vertical sense along a plunging zone within the conduit. As we go over to the eastern deeps, further to the east, here's the tail end of the ovoid. This is the southeast extension, the massive sulfides of the ovoid, of the eastern deeps, and the far eastern deeps. Those are all projected to surface onto the geology here. And these are sitting in association with a series of rocks that are referred to as mineralized troctolites or variable textured troctolites, which are shown in this blue color. These are effectively the host to much of the mineralization that comprises the deposit at depth. And the isopachs you actually see here are the thickness of these mineralized troctolites. So you can see where the base of the chamber here has 20 or 30 meters of massive sulfide sitting at the bottom. There is a 600-meter thick halo of disseminated sulfide wrapping around it and lapping up against the north wall of the eastern deeps, which is this line, this structure running along the north side. The entry point of the deeps from that conduit is shown by this dotted line, and you can see that the bulk of the mineralization actually sits right in front of the conduit, where the conduit materials have actually been dumped into the base of the chamber, and the halo of variable troctolite is an index. That halo was incredibly important from an exploration perspective because you knew when you hit thick variable troctolite, you were near the economic heart of the system. If things significantly thinned, then your expectations were commensurately lower. And that actually was very useful. It was also useful in better delineating the edges of the mineralized system. Here's a section through. I've showed you this in my earlier presentation, but I'd just like to emphasize here this halo of disseminated sulfide that wraps over the system. I'd also like to emphasize this conduit-like dike, which bends over at depth and becomes almost subvertical, and the presence of what we think are failed conduits on the north wall, where perhaps multiple entry points. Somehow this disseminated mineralization got in here, and we think some of them probably fed in at higher levels, but very little of the material remains because the gneiss is effectively closed down and closed off the magma channelway, just leaving a rather messy bunch of rocks. We refer often locally as a feeder melange, but it's basically a hornblende gabbro that is immensely rich in different types of gneiss fragment and occasionally with a little bit of trace sulfide mineralization. The key feature also on this section is that the eastern deeps, as I mentioned earlier, is cut by these younger syenites and granites. They do quite a lot of damage to the overlying halo of highly disseminated sulfide, but this material isn't economic. What is actually very convenient is that they don't do any damage to the main ore body in this area here. It's almost free of any late younger granitoids. The massive sulfides have a halo around of semi-massive sulfide in a series of breccias, and those are surrounded by a series of disseminated sulfides, which have a somewhat spotted appearance, and we refer to them as leopard textured troctolites. and they form a halo. So the more massive and probable economic zone of the mineralization comprises the ores, which are economic zone of the mineralization comprises the ores which are red, which contain no fragments at all, or the orange-colored material, which often contain ultramafic and mafic fragments, as well as troctolite fragments. If you take a section through the Eastern Deeps, and this is just one section through, I think it was, which hole was it? 194. So it goes through the economic heart of the Eastern Deeps. What I've shown here is the abundance of nickel and copper in 100% sulfide. So this is not the nickel grade of the sulfide. This is not the nickel grade of the rock. It is the nickel grade of the sulfide component of the rock. We refer to this as the nickel tenor, which I'm sure can be very confusing because the word in French means the same thing as grade. So be very cautious when you use this word. What I'm showing here is the nickel and copper concentration in the sulfide part of the rock. So it's normalized to 100%. This is depth down the hole, and these are the copper values in sulfide in yellow, and the nickel values are shown in green. And the size of these bubbles is sized according to the sulfide content. So the really big bubbles here are all massive sulfides. These will be massive sulfide stringers higher up. These smaller bubbles correspond to breccia sequence rocks in this area here. And then above it, this comprises the variable textured troctolites with disseminated sulfides. And you can see from the point of view of the tenor variations of the sulfide, especially for nickel, there is a fundamental break in the nickel tenor of the sulfide. The economic heart of the deposit, which is down in this area here, is part of a sequence of low tenor material, which has between 3 and 4% nickel and 100% sulfide. The halo of disseminated sulfide has a totally different nickel tenor. It's sulfide which is derived from a different location, and there is a marked break. And you can draw a line through that break in any drill hole throughout the Voisey's Bay deposit and actually contour the economic heart of the deposit, which obviously is very useful from the point of view of delineation of the ore reserve, because you know how much drilling you need to do in order to encounter rocks of this particular package. You can see as you go higher up in the chamber, the amount of nickel in the sulfide component of the rock increases, but the bubbles become much smaller. The amount of sulfide drops to almost trace levels, and this carries on probably in this hole here for another several hundred meters with backwards and forwards into disseminated sulfide before you go out of the variable textured troctolite at the top of the system. The break in nickel is also to some extent evident in the break in copper. It's evident certainly in the nickel-cobalt ratio of the sulfides. The textures that comprise this sequence and the way you actually recognize it as a geologist in drill core when you see it is highlighted by these series of slides here. Rock E comprises what we refer to as the breccia sequence. It comprises a matrix of olivine gabbro and ferrogabbro. It contains fragments of paranise, which are highly resorbed, and sometimes the mineralogy of that paranise is almost entirely taken into the structure of the olivine gabbro, so that you see olivine turning into orthoperoxene, and you see the development of hersonitic spinels scattered throughout the matrix of the host rock. This rock often has finely disseminated sulfide, and very often there is a lamination of the fragments parallel to the base of the chamber, characteristic feature. The massive sulfides above it, typically loop textures, nets of pentlandite and scattered magnetite. As you go higher up, you see the development of these very strong fabrics, and this fabric corresponds to this break in nickel tenor. And so there is clearly a structure within the chamber, a subhorizontal structure. Above this level, you get disseminated sulfides, and these texturally show similar rock types right the way to the top of the variable troctolite as the proportion of sulfide drops off. The tenor variations in the Eastern Deeps are quite systematic. This is a wireframe model of the Eastern Deeps with 4 sections shown where the tenor variations are superimposed. And you can see the distribution of the green material and the yellow material at the base, which is the economic heart of the system, can be tracked from section to section. And this is quite useful from the point of view of following the right style of mineralization. The other feature that this slide shows on the basis of the whole deposit is that there are enormous variations in chemistry from one deposit zone to another. This is just the variation in nickel tenor of sulfide versus the cobalt tenor of sulfide. These rocks here come from the ovoid deposit and the mini ovoid. They have a totally different nickel-cobalt ratio to the samples that come from the Eastern Deeps deposit. And in terms of absolute tenor abundances, the rocks, the sulfide mineralization from within the conduits typically has a much lower tenor than the mineralization that sits in the chamber. So chamber mineralization is usually seen as more valuable. Going to the west in the area of the Reed Brook zone, the mineralization spreads out along subhorizontal structures, and probably about 60 or 70% of the mineralization here is not contained in the dike. It's contained in flat structures entirely devoid of olivine gabbro or troctolite. These areas have been drilled off in enormous detail, and they comprise individual ore bodies, and we believe they probably a number of these systems along the length of the dike. There's an upper level, the upper Reed Brook zone, and just above the western subchamber is the lower Reed Brook zone, and both of these continue from west to east and plunge at around about 45 degrees down the dike. The dike is disconnected from the Western Deeps intrusion by a thin layer of gneiss, and so this is a kind of unusual situation. You don't expect to see massive sulfides at the top of intrusion. Well, they're not really at the top of the Western Deeps intrusion. They're within a conduit that appears to bend around the top of the intrusion. The facies are quite complex, from massive sulfides laterally into inclusion-rich sulfides, and then into more typical leopard-textured troctolites. The series of rocks you recognize quite beautifully from the central part of the system here. Massive sulfides are obviously 100% sulfide. These are inclusion-packed, and as you go increasingly towards this, more and more sulfide picks up, and you start to see the development of leopard texture. These develop either side of the zone that plunges down the dike, and the style of facies you see in the lithology is critical in understanding which side of the massive sulfide you actually sit on. 3D models show these plunging zones. This is the Reed Brook zone, which we've now extended down to a depth of around about 1,800 meters, and we're busily infilling some of those zones of mineralization on the way. The relationships at Voisey's Bay, as I mentioned earlier, are critically structurally controlled. The flexure on the dike is controlled by a lineament that extends east to west. The north wall of the Eastern Deeps is controlled by a fault-like structure, which we call the north wall structure. And the whole of the Red Dog chamber is offset from the Eastern Deeps chamber by about 700 meters along a younger fault, which actually took that segment of the Voisey's Bay complex to the east. So coming back to the simple geological relationships all put onto one section, the red dotted line gives you an idea of the depth of knowledge and exploration. We know quite a lot about the ovoid, the feeder zone that goes to it. We know virtually nothing about the Western Deeps intrusion, and we suspect somewhere down here there is a target to find where these sulfides were actually pumped into the system. We think there may be a second conduit coming in the south. We have actually found evidence for this in a number of locations where there is a series of troctolites in the gneisses feeding into the Eastern Deeps chamber from the south. We've yet to find any ore body that's associated with that, but that is clearly one of our targets. And another critical target, which we're increasingly understanding, are these flat structures that drag the mineralization out of the dike structure. That's it. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you very much also to all the people who've worked with me over 15 years on the Voisey's Bay deposit. It's been a real pleasure to work with such a great team of geologists, and they have contributed so much to this presentation. It's very hard to acknowledge everything. Thank you.
Merci, Dr. Lightfoot. On aura le temps pour une seule question. Oui, Robert.
What's your preferred mechanism for injecting massive sulfide into the cellular ashes?
Yeah, the injection of massive sulfides is quite hard work.
Yes.
Processes that allow for this, one of them might be that if this, that the sulfides are actually entrained as a sufficiently fine dissemination within the magma and then localized in pockets where perhaps the turbulence of the magma allows the sulfide to settle out. A second option is some sort of tectonic pumping, a mechanism that actually drops a chamber down and shoves the material in the lower chamber up the dike, and as the thing adjusts, different generations of sulfide come into play up the dike. So I'd call that a tectonic plumbing option. Which one it is, I'm sorry, I
All right,
don't know.
thanks. Is there anything left of the ore void, or is this all mined out?
It's about half gone now.
Okay, so there's still a chance to see it in the pit?
Oh yes.
Yeah, all right, thanks.
OK, merci beaucoup, Dr. Lightfoot.